December 1989. Inside a military barracks in the city of Târgoviște, two trembling figures, handcuffed and cornered by history, were preparing to die. Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu, the couple who had ruled Romania for decades with an iron fist, were minutes away from being executed by a firing squad. The cameras were ready, the soldiers too. But to understand how Romania ended its dictatorship live on television, we must go back to the roots of the regime, to the years when history began to twist. Nicolae Ceaușescu was born in 1918 in Scornicești, a rural village in southern Romania. He was the third of 10 children. His father, a poor and alcoholic peasant, raised him in a house without electricity or running water. Nicolae barely finished primary school. At the age of 11, he was sent to Bucharest to work as a shoemaker's apprentice. His childhood wasn't just humble, it was brutal. That harshness shaped him. In the 1930s, Romania was a monarchy marked by deep inequalities. Industrialization had barely begun, repression was constant, and in that context, Ceaușescu found refuge in communism. At 14, he joined the then illegal communist youth organization. He was arrested several times and cycled in and out of prison, but there he learned what would truly define his character: the party's discipline and silence. In prison, he met Gheorghiu Dej, a powerful communist leader. Ceaușescu became his protege. Under his wing, Nicolae rose through the ranks. He lacked charisma, but he obeyed without question and knew how to wait. When the Soviet army occupied Romania in 1944, everything changed. The king was forced to abdicate, the People's Republic was declared, and communism, with Moscow's backing, was installed with brutal efficiency. Between 1947 and 1952, tens of thousands of opponents were imprisoned, executed, or sent to labor camps. The middle class was dismantled, land was nationalized, factories confiscated. Romania became a grim replica of the Soviet model, and Ceaușescu slowly climbed the ranks of power. In 1965, Gheorghiu Dej died suddenly. To everyone's surprise, Ceaușescu was chosen as his successor. He was 47 years old, and with a mix of rural shyness and iron determination, began rewriting the history of his country and his own. His early years were surprisingly well received. He condemned Stalinist repression, released political prisoners, allowed a timid cultural opening, and distanced himself from the Kremlin. In 1968, when the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, Ceaușescu was one of the few communist leaders to condemn the invasion publicly. He did so from a balcony, greeted by applause. The West applauded too. Romania was courted by Washington, Paris, and London. It received massive loans from the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and European nations. Ceaușescu became the good communist, an awkward ally of Moscow, but useful in Cold War geopolitics. But that image didn't last. In parallel with his foreign policy, Ceaușescu was constructing a regime of total control. After a visit to North Korea and China in 1971, he returned fascinated by totalitarianism. He introduced what he called the New Cultural Revolution. From then on, the country began to change. The Communist Party became completely subordinate to his image. Laws were passed requiring media to show his face daily. His biography was rewritten. False achievements were attributed to him. Schools, factories, plazas, and hospitals were named after Ceaușescu. His wife, Elena, was made vice president of the state council despite having no real scientific education. She was given fake titles: academic, inventor, doctor in chemistry. No one could contradict it. The parliament passed laws unanimously. Trade unions were a facade. Television showed Ceaușescu's face for hours. Even the weather seemed to obey him. Romania became a socialist monarchy, but instead of a royal family, it had a revolutionary one. None of this would have been possible without the Securitate, one of the largest and most ruthless secret police forces in the communist world. It's estimated that the Securitate had nearly 500,000 informants for a population of only 23 million. They tapped phones, opened mail, spied on family gatherings, and recruited snitches, even in elementary schools. There were microphones in homes and offices. People were interrogated without court orders. Prisons were full of dissidents, artists, priests, and students. Torture was systematic. But the worst punishment was silence, to be erased from public life. The goal wasn't just to punish, It was to ensure no one even dared think differently. In 1981, Ceaușescu made a decision that would seal Romania's fate. He ordered the full repayment of all foreign debt at any cost. To do this, he exported most of the country's agricultural and industrial production. Food, energy, machinery, all sold abroad. Inside Romania, people starved. Bread was rationed, meat disappeared, electricity was limited, hot water was shut off for weeks, heating was turned off by law, even in winter. People lived with 2 hours of state-controlled television a day. Malnutrition became chronic. Infant mortality increased. Birth rates fell. But propaganda said the opposite. It showed record harvests, scientific breakthroughs, and imaginary achievements. Romania was lying to survive. Meanwhile, Ceaușescu launched one of Europe's most extravagant projects, the Palace of the People, also known as the People's House, a building of over 300,000 square meters, with marble, gold, crystal chandeliers, and colossal staircases. To build it, more than 9,000 historic buildings, churches, synagogues, and entire neighborhoods were demolished. A fifth of Bucharest's historic center was destroyed. People were evicted without warning, all to build a monument to Ceaușescu's ego. The palace was designed to be larger than the Pentagon, and it succeeded. But by the time it neared completion, Romania was one of the poorest countries in Europe. In March 1989, 6 senior Communist Party officials sent a critical letter, the Letter of the Six. It was a historic move. Foreign media read it on air. For the first time, the regime's elite broke the silence. Across Eastern Europe, communist regimes were falling like dominoes. In Poland, solidarity was forcing elections. Hungary opened its border with Austria. The Berlin Wall fell in East Germany. The Velvet Revolution triumphed in Czechoslovakia. Only Romania seemed frozen in time. Ceaușescu refused to change. He doubled down. In November 1989, he was unanimously re-elected as Party General Secretary. Shortly after, he traveled to Iran to meet Ayatollah Khomeini. While tensions at home were boiling over, he returned confident, believing everything was under control. He was wrong. On December 16th, in the city of Timișoara, protests erupted to defend a Protestant pastor, Laszlo Tokes, who was about to be evicted by the regime. He was a critic, but not a radical. Hundreds gathered to support him. The police responded with force. The protest grew. The next day, thousands marched. The repression was brutal. There were shootings. Tanks were used. Civilians died. Some were thrown into rivers. Others buried in mass graves. But the truth got out. Foreign journalists broadcast the images. Hungarian TV showed the bodies. Within hours, all of Romania knew. What began as a local protest had become a national uprising, and for the first time, the regime hesitated. On December 21st, Ceaușescu addressed a crowd from the balcony of the Central Committee. But this time, there were no cheers. People booed. Ceaușescu froze. He looked at Elena, mumbled. Someone cut the broadcast. It was the collapse, live and unfiltered. By the next morning, revolution was in full swing. On December 22nd, the streets of Bucharest filled with workers, students, soldiers, and ordinary citizens who were no longer afraid. Government buildings were stormed. Portraits of the dictator destroyed. State microphones were seized. Broadcasters cried on air, confessing years of lies. At the Ministry of Defense, some officers joined the people. Inside the party HQ, chaos reigned. Ceaușescu's security collapsed. At 1:29 p.m., Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu climbed to the building's roof. A helicopter was waiting. Their escape had begun. They flew north with no clear destination. They were turned away from several places. The system built around their cult was gone. No one obeyed. No one wanted them. They were no longer rulers. They were fugitives. Hours later, the helicopter pilot was warned, land or be shot down. He landed near Târgoviște. There, a local officer, who days before might have kissed their hands, arrested them. They were locked in a military base. In Bucharest, the revolutionaries had seized the national television station. Presenters, artists, and military officers broadcast hours of chaotic news. A new provisional government, the National Salvation Front, was announced, led by Ion Iliescu, a former communist who had broken with Ceaușescu. Rumors spread. Some said Ceaușescu was in Moscow. Others claimed a counterattack was imminent. Paranoia gripped the country. People spoke of loyalist terrorists. Gunfire echoed from rooftops at night. Explosions shook the city, but no one knew who was shooting. Even with the dictator gone, his shadow still inspired fear. And then came the decision, a secret, immediate trial to be broadcast after the fact. On December 25, 1989, Christmas Day, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu were brought before a military tribunal. The trial took place in a poorly lit room at the Târgoviște military unit. There was no real defense, no jury, no due process. It lasted less than an hour. The charges: genocide, undermining the state, destroying the national economy, illegal enrichment, and attempted escape with state funds. The Ceaușescus refused to recognize the court. They mocked the judges. Elena hurled insults. Nicolae sang the socialist anthem. They denied everything, demanded a lawyer. They didn't get one. The verdict: death penalty, immediate execution. They were led to the courtyard, hands tied with shoelaces. A cold, bare wall awaited. Elena screamed. Nicolae tried to remain composed. A soldier offered blindfolds. They refused. At 2:50 p.m., 3 soldiers fired simultaneously. Over 120 bullets were shot. Nicolae's body fell sideways. Elena's, backwards. A thick silence followed the shots. Romania had just killed its dictator, but didn't yet know it. Everything was filmed by order of the new government. The footage, grainy and poorly focused, showed the essentials: the trial, the shouting, the faces of a crumbling regime. On December 26th, the footage was broadcast on national television. Millions of Romanians watched. Some cried, some applauded, others didn't know how to feel. It was the first time in modern history that a communist dictator was overthrown so quickly, and his death shown on television. What happened in Târgoviște remains controversial. By any legal standard, the trial was illegal. There was no due process, no fair defense. It was a summary execution, disguised as a tribunal, but it was also a pressure release. Romanian society was fractured. Institutions had collapsed. There was fear, anger, and confusion. Ceaușescu's corpse became a symbol, proof that the regime was over. Broadcasting his execution wasn't just political justice, it was a psychological operation, a brutal message. It's over. In the years that followed, Romania tried to rebuild, but the past didn't die with one man. Thousands of Securitate files were declassified, stories of betrayal, spying between friends, broken families. Many bureaucrats of the old regime were recycled into the new government. Iliescu himself became president. The palace that Ceaușescu built still stands. Today it houses the parliament, a monument to excess, delusion, and difficult memory. And the tape of the trial still circulates. The images of December 25, 1989 still shock, not because of the blood, but because of what they represent. A poor country, after decades of repression, shook off its fear. A dictator, after decades of absolute power, faced a brick wall. A revolution broadcast live that used television as its final weapon. Ceaușescu's death was not the end of the story. It was only the first act of a long, messy, and still unfinished transition. But for a few minutes, in a dimly lit room, with bullets and cameras, history seemed to deliver justice, or at least something like it.